Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and today we're going to learn how to create realistic fluid simulations inside of Adobe After Effects and Trapcode Particular 4. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, if you'd like to follow along with this exercise, you'll need to download the Trapcode Fluids Starter Kit, which is available for free with this tutorial. Okay, so here we are in After Effects. Once you've downloaded the pack, you can simply open it up. We've got the project file that we're going to be working with, and also the assets folder, which has all the resources like the custom sprites and also these custom OBJ emitters. So you can simply go ahead and open up this file here, and then you can start following along with this video. Now, it is important to remember that we're using Trapcode Particular 4, as this is the version which includes the fluids system in the physics section, which all of the project files that we're using rely on that system. It's also important to remember that version 4 of Trapcode Particular is only compatible with Adobe After Effects CC 2017 or later. So before we begin, let's start with a quick overview of what's included in the Trapcode Fluids Starter Kit. This pack contains 6 unique project files that will help you get started with Trapcode Fluids. First off, we have the Fireball Explosion. This effect uses advanced shaders to produce realistic looking fire that simulates burning fuel. The fluid engine uses dynamic turbulence to create a heat vortex effect which simulates rising fumes. For those times when you don't want fire on your explosions, we have the Dust Blast. Perfect for creating those large scale explosions in a desert-like environment. The rapidly expanding smoke interacts with a large volume of atmospheric pressure. The resulting effect is a clearly defined mushroom cloud. Next, we have the Wispy Smoke preset. This is great for creating those smaller scale simulations that require an increased level of complexity and detail. My personal favourite is to use this effect to create realistic muzzle smoke, for those times when stock footage just isn't enough. For this project, we decided to scale things up a bit to create the Fuel Air Bomb. This effect simulates a cloud of gas which then ignites into a massive fireball. We also added some camera effects to simulate the rapid change in exposure. The Smoke Pellet effect uses Trapcode Particular's default cloudlet, so you can easily change the colour to resemble a blast of something else like anti-air flak. We also included a free library of custom explosive shaped OBJ emitters to use with Trapcode Particular. This allows the particles to spawn into a more organic shaped volume before being influenced by the fluids. Finally, we have the Trapcode Fluid Fire. With this effect, we wanted to create a fully dynamic fire simulation inside of After Effects that was comparable to other effects programs like Blender or Houdini. It's one thing to have stock footage of an explosion or a pre-cached render, but nothing quite compares to having a fully interactive effects simulation directly inside of After Effects. The Trapcode Fluids Starter Kit gives you all the tools needed to create your own professional and customized effects. Okay, so now that we've seen what the Fluid Kit can do, let's jump in and start modifying some of these effects. So we're going to take this Wispy Smoke sprite and we're going to modify it so that it looks more like a burst of muzzle smoke. Now before we jump into the settings here, we've got the assets. This is where you'll find all the custom sprites if you need access to those. We've got all the projects in here. And we've also got the custom OBJ emitters, so that's where you access those if you want to bring them into the comp and use them as an emitter. So let's go to our Wispy Smoke sprite and we'll click on the effects controls over here. Now currently we're using an explosive mold custom OBJ here, but we're actually going to go and change that to use one of Trapcode's default objects here. So we'll choose the torus effect here. And then let's have a little look at what this is looking like. So we can see we've got our ring here. And the reason we've got two rings is because we are initially keyframing the emitter size here. So what I think we'll do is we'll just disable those keyframes and we'll just maybe keep the emitter size on something like 200. Okay, so then we want to rotate this ring round, so we'll rotate that, see, in the y-axis. And then what we can do is take our camera here. We'll just pan the camera over to the side so we can see what we're doing a bit better. Okay, so the particles per second are also being keyframed. So currently we have 10,000 particles per second being emitted, but that only lasts for about a 25th of a frame, so it's not actually as many particles as it seems. I think what we'll do is we'll just set this to explode so that the particles will only be emitted on the first frame, and let's just try setting this to a modest value of 10,000 over one frame. Let's see what we have. Now, one thing we could do, we are going to use fluids to propel the particle system across the screen, but we could also help it out a little bit just by animating the position of the particles over one frame. So just push them that way a little bit. Now we're going to want to make sure we have velocity from motion disabled, because what I've noticed is that if you try to increase the velocity, the fluids react in a really volatile and quite just chaotic looking way that doesn't look very natural. It normally starts with the fluids getting injected, and then all of a sudden the velocity kicks in and they just wobble around in a very jarring way. So we're going to keep those values at 0. Okay, then if we come down to the physics section here, we can start accessing the physics for the particles here. Let's see what we have so far. I'm going to make this background a little bit darker just so we can see what's going on. Just highlight the smoke a bit better. By the way, if you were wondering about this background, it's actually a procedural cloud layer, and you can actually animate those clouds to move across the sky as well. Currently I disabled the movement because it's a bit distracting, but yeah, we've got those clouds there. That's just being created with this fractal noise effect, so we won't cover that, but you can obviously go in there and use this background. So let's do a quick cache and see what's happening here. Okay, so currently the fluid force is set to buoyancy and swirl only. And so the particles are being emitted, and then these forces here, random swirl in X, Y, and Z dimensions, and swirl scale are what is creating this flow distortion. So the swirl scale here, in fact, the lower this number is, essentially the larger the swirl will be. Let's just bring this back and do that again. See, when we have the swirl scale low, we actually get a much larger movement. And then of course the random swirl here, this is just the power behind that swirl. So I like to keep it at 10. And as you can see, we've got the swirl scale here, so that if we start increasing that, that'll increase the fine detail of what we've got. So we can put these two values to say 25, so we'll have a very strong but also quite detailed turbulent effect. We can also go to the global physics controls here, and we're going to increase this value later, but that might slow the things down a bit. We're just going to add a bit of viscosity. And we'll also decrease the simulation fidelity. The higher this number is, the longer it will take, and it will also create some much more sort of refined, maybe more detailed movements of the fluids, but This will work better if we just use a lower number, and we'll speed things up a bit. So next thing we want to change is our force region size. So remember the emitter size for our ring is only 200, so we don't want to go too far above that. I mean, if we start increasing this value, the force of the fluid region is going to be much larger than the part we decreased it there, so that's why nothing's happening. Add another 0 and then we can see particles are being pushed out quite a lot more. We can actually see separation in the smoke if we were to keep increasing that. And I can't imagine that's going to look great, but you know, just to see what kind of effect it has. This is why it's useful to use the custom sprites that are provided in the pack. So we've got these custom smoke sprites, and with a bit of motion blur, even if a single sprite gets separated by itself, it can still hold up and it can look okay. Whereas if you were just using spheres, you'd need a lot more particles to be able to pull off any kind of a believable effect. So obviously that's way too high for that, so we'll put this down to just 250. Now we can also change this relative force position. So if we were to start moving this over, now you can see this little point here. Now essentially as that moves over, you have to imagine that the force of the position is basically coming from here. So whatever force is being applied to our fluid simulation will now be in this area. As we move this across, it would start to move over to the other side, and eventually it would cease to really have any effect on the particles. So let's bring that over to say like 100, and that's because we want to see, we're going to create this kind of bell shape here where the muzzle jets out and then expands, and so that's why we've moved the relative position over. Now we're actually going to change this fluids model to be a Vortex Ring. And we've got some settings here. So if we were to increase this to 400, which is the maximum, you can see we've created a vortex ring that's going to move upwards. Now of course we want that to move across the screen with our smoke. So let's change the vortex tilt to 90. And let's have a look at what we've created now. So each one of these steps is taking us closer and closer to the muzzle smoke effect that we want. So I think that cloud is looking a little bit too big, so let's decrease the vortex core size. This is starting to get a bit closer to what we want. Now you might be thinking, well, it looks a bit too slow to be muzzle smoke. We want this to be a much more violent blast. So what we can do then is go to the fluid time factor and start increasing this. And the higher this value is, the more rapid and volatile, and I think it's going to increase the number of particles as well, so we might actually want to reduce that. So I'm going to allow this to keep caching. Let's have a quick look. So it should be moving a bit more quickly now. And this is kind of similar to how we were creating the dust explosion. So that's looking quite good, but I think we can add a bit more speed to it. So I'm going to increase the fluid times factor to 5, and we're going to get a much more dramatic result now. And of course we're going to have even more particles again, so let's just reduce that. Keep the count quite low just so we can see what's going on, and we can increase it later. Right, so what we can do, we'll increase the particles a little bit more. Let's also go into the particle size, so we're keyframing that. Let's disable that keyframe. We'll just keep them. We'll see what they look like at 200. Might be a bit too big. What we can do is we'll go into the size over life, and we'll just animate this so we get more of a continuous expansion in size. And of course, let's increase the lifetime and also the life randomness of the particles. Just going to put, since we've increased the size, we might not need as many particles. So we're definitely getting that nice swirling effect that we'd expect to see with some muzzle smoke. So I actually think the rotation of the particles might be a little bit exaggerated with the physics, so let's just go to the rotation and we'll just maybe just put this down a bit because we have sped things up so much. Let's have a look at what the opacity is doing. So the opacity looks fine. Now that we've got the smoke where we want it to be, we can actually start adding some sparks to this. So we can actually have sparks and smoke in the same simulation. So all we'll do is we'll set this up. So we'll go start at 0% of lifetime, stop emitting at say 5% for now, emit maybe 10 particles. I'm just making up all these values. Put the particle velocity up, definitely inherit all of the velocity, make them incredibly fast, maybe even faster than that, like 0.5. Go for a cloudlet here. We're going to want to choose our own color for it, so we'll go to the color over life and quickly create our color profile for sparks. So that's a almost yellowy white, followed by a pastely orange, followed by a darker, almost browny red here, but not quite completely red. Let's put the blending mode to additive. Let's actually give it some opacity. Put the size down. Okay, so we should be seeing something now. Okay, size way too high. Let's go to the opacity over life. We'll do the old linear ramp. Do the same thing here. Let's go to the turbulence settings and we'll give them some gravity. And they've got some turbulence, maybe a bit more turbulence, maybe a bit more air resistance so we can have them come to a stop faster. Okay, let's increase these values here. That's an interesting looking fluid sparks in Trapcode Particular. It's quite a cool effect. Let's increase the velocity to 150 here. I'm also going to go to our keyframed position. I'm actually going to shift this over even more to get a more violent forward burst. If you're wondering, we do have motion blur enabled, so that's already effective. Right, so we're definitely getting a much more violent burst of sparks. The smoke is moving across the screen a lot more, and that all looks good. We don't want to overdo it with the sparks. In fact, I might even put the life of them down a little bit. I mean, I can't decide whether I want this to be like a musket shot, something like that, where there are definitely more sparks. Of course, you'd probably have your own muzzle flash element, so let's just reduce the sparks. We'll put the emission probability down. We're going to put the size. Actually, rather than decreasing the size, we'll just go to the size over life and we'll just add a bit of an intro soft ramp here. We'll just copy that curve, put it in the, remember we're in the sections for the auxiliary particles right now. I want to see what happens if we just put this all the way up to 1000. Okay, it looks a bit ridiculous. Whatever it was before is best. Keep it as that. Okay, so now we've got our sparks and our muzzle smoke. And of course, the best thing about this is we've got a very realistic looking asset. We can make, you know, an infinite number of variations of it. We can do all sorts of crazy stuff, like go to the camera settings and move the camera into the smoke for some, if you want to do that for some reason. Someone decides to shoot a shot right at the camera, but you don't actually want the camera to get shot. Of course, we can do that. If we wanted this sharpness, the detail in the smoke to be exaggerated, there is quite a bit of detail in there. Let's see what we can do. We increase the radius here, maybe get a bit more sharpness in the smoke. Just seeing what kind of color correction we could do. Of course, it's going to be a fair. Okay, maybe not. It's an experiment. If we do want to do that though, if we really want to sell the fact that it's a muzzle flash, we could add a muzzle flash in, but actually what I'm thinking of doing is adding some lighting effects, real lights into the simulation that will illuminate the particles from within. So let's go create another default camera here just to fix the one that we made. We'll go and we'll put a light in here. So we're going to go light. Yeah, we'll create this point light first. I've actually got a point light here, which I made earlier, that's got an intensity of 1000. We've just selected this type of orange here. So we've got a point light. Shouldn't do anything yet. And then we're also going to create a ambient light, and we'll put this to just be white with an intensity of 1,000,000. No, an intensity of 100. And we're also going to want to grab the position data of our particle system. In fact, we can go into here, move this up a bit. Let's see what we've got. We've got this value here. We want to make sure the light is in the same position as our muzzle flash. Is it? Is that where it was? I kind of get the feeling that it's actually more over the other side. Oh, of course, because we're using the animated values, aren't we? We want to use these values instead. Okay, so this isn't going to be affecting the particles yet, but if we go into the shading options here, we enable shading. I see we've got After Effects AE lights. So I think this version here looks better. We'll put the ambient power here to 100. So if we were to disable the point light, we've still got the same lighting whether shading is turned on or off. Although what's quite interesting is we can actually use that to make the particles darker, and then they only really get fully illuminated with the muzzle flash here. We'll obviously change that with the diffuse. Probably try and keep it rather modest just for the time being. So we're obviously just going to want to have this last for, say, like a... Maybe we'll keyframe this. Maybe we'll just have... We don't want our sparks are already additive. We don't want them to look too bright. If this tutorial was going on forever, I'd probably make the sparks a little bit smaller at the beginning, a bit more fine detail. Okay, then we get to the actual muzzle flash, and actually no, those sparks are really annoying me now. Let's just put them down to screen. That messes everything up. Let's keep them on add. Let's just nerf the size. I'm actually just going to go in here and I'm going to seriously restrict the size. Have them take a lot longer to come in. Let's keep bringing the size down. I don't want them to overpower the effect. Let's just bring the opacity down as well. It would be nice to be able to have a separate shading system for the auxiliary particles and the main particles, but that's just me being picky. Going back to the shading then, yeah, that's fine. This is the point where we now need our light to shut off. So I wonder, do we want it to be any brighter than that? Nah, we'll keep it on 80. Let's just see what that looks like. Okay, that's lasting way too long. Let's bring that down even more. I'm just trimming this light layer here. Okay, so how many frames that last for? 1, 2, 3. I'm actually just going to try getting rid of the keyframe on our diffuse here and just relying on one set of keyframes for the light, just to keep things a bit more simpler. And let's just see what it looks like from the other angle. So I think the lighting can be adjusted on a per shot basis here, because from this angle you don't really see the effects of the lighting as much. That's because if we go back to here and we look at our lighting, sometimes when you rotate the camera and more particles get stacked up on top of each other, you won't actually see the lighting as much, but if you come back around here, you're actually going to get a much more exaggerated effect. And so maybe if you're doing it from this angle, this is why it'd be better just to literally have 2 keyframes. Maybe from this angle we'll just put that light intensity down a bit. And I'd probably be tempted to make another smoke element, maybe for like the shell ejection casing, or maybe a slightly larger element. Maybe combine a few of them together and you can really get creative. Right, so we'll wrap things up there. Before we go, let's just have a quick look at what's happening in some of these other comps here. So we've got our fire here, so we've actually got this separate layer here, which is like this quick flash. Then obviously we've got the fuel explosion on top of there. Obviously quite nice, got that quite nice oily sort of dark multiplied colouring there on the fuel. Then we also have this glow sprite, and that's set to auto orient towards camera. We've also got a lens exposure here and a little lens flare, just to add a little bit of an extra pop at the beginning. So yeah, that's the explosive fireball one here. We've got the dust sprite, and this one's quite interesting because we have first we have the dust cloud itself. We have these shockwave particles come out to form this little shockwave. We also have these dirt particles. Now these ones, they're actually just using the normal bounce physics model of Trapcode Particular, but it's quite cool to actually be able to combine a few of these particle systems together. The dust cloud one actually has 2 particle systems in it. So one of them is this little cloud of smoke at the bottom here that forms this base, and then so you've got the stalk, and then you've got the mushroom, and you've even got a bit of smoke here coming over there. We'll put all of these effects on, and of course we've got these cameras here. So we've got a camera we can have a look at from different angles. I've been a little bit conservative with how many particles I've used to create this shockwave, but as we need more particles to fill up the space, probably go in here and maybe increase the size of them a bit as well for the angle that we're doing. And as you increase the number of particles, you're going to see the shading get exaggerated as well. So we can just fix that by coming down to the, minimize all of these, coming down to the shading settings here. We could just start decreasing the opacity to compensate for the extra number of particles that we have, till we get the effect we want. Let's go look at the last project here. So we've actually got the smoke and the fire separately, so we've got some nice smoke fluids here. Every time you click around on the timeline here, see if we want to go ahead in the timeline, Trapcode actually has to cache in the whole fluid simulation up to that point, so that's why it's often quicker at the beginning and then takes longer. If you like click down here, it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to cache the whole simulation up to this point. So obviously we've got our fire here. So if we want to use a different OBJ emitter in our smoke simulation here, we can actually go into Trapcode Particular. We can go into the Choose OBJ section. We can actually go Add New OBJ, and this is the library of explosive molds that you'll get in the Trapcode Starter Kit. So we could just load in some of these, and it'll actually generate. As you can see, we've got these little explosive mold things. So let's go and just choose maybe this one. Looks interesting. Now it does have to recache the whole thing and generate it again, and the only times the program's ever crashed for me is when I'm reloading OBJ emitters in the middle of a simulation, especially if it's cached a whole bunch of it. Sometimes that can cause a crash. Let's have a look at some of these. So we've got, I think that might be the one we were using. I'm just really curious to see what this looks like. Oh my god. Someone made a gun out of smoke. How did that happen? Okay, well on that note, we'll wrap things up there. So a lot of work went into making this pack, so if you could share this video with anyone who's interested in particle animation, I'd definitely appreciate that. Okay, and be sure to let us know what you want to see in the comments in future, and thanks for watching.